Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp. Today, we have a wonderful guest with us, Janet Kellogg Ray. She is the author of an incredible book called The God of Monkey Science: People of Faith in a Modern Scientific World. Janet is a science educator who grew up a creationist. She holds a PhD in curriculum and instruction with 18 years of university science teaching, both biology majors and non-majors. Janet, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, and you're from Texas and live in Texas now. Is that correct?
I am with just a short sojourn in Atlanta. I've been
All
in
right.
Texas my whole life.
Okay, and you must be a Cowboys fan, I imagine.
Absolutely huge Cowboys fan,
All right.
lifelong.
I'm not going to hold it against you. I'm a Pats fan, but fun fact for me and you, my son is an avid Dallas Cowboys fan, so he's rooting for you. So,
Oh, well,
uh,
that's good because it takes perseverance to be a Cowboys fan.
yeah,
I'll tell
these
you
days,
that.
right? I
Yeah.
told my son, you picked the wrong era to be a Cowboys fan. You should have done it when I was a sad Pats fan, right? So, okay, well, we're going to have a great conversation today. You have a tremendous book that helps people debunk pseudoscience on out there, and particularly around vaccines, COVID-19 conspiracy theories, and climate science. You also have a fascinating story, a former or creationist to someone who accepts evolution, which is one of the reasons I wanted you on the podcast. We're going to be talking about everything from the creation evolution debate, a little bit about intelligent design theory. I'm anxious to hear your take on that, as I have some pro and con things to say about that. Also, we'll be talking about how evangelicals went from pro-vaccine in years past, never a problem with it, to many being anti-vaxxers today, as well as doubters in climate science. So let's get started. But I thought we'd begin by hearing some of your background. What's your religious background? And in a nutshell, how did you kind of come to be a creationist as a growing up, and then now a science educator who remained a Christian but now believes in evolution?
Well, I was raised in the Churches of Christ, which
Uh-huh.
is a conservative, probably fundamentalist wing of evangelicalism. The church of my growing up years of my was absolutely central to my family's life. Uh, all of our friends, our social life revolved around what was going on at our church. We went to church 3 times a week, rain or shine. And I often say the most scarring aspect of that upbringing was the fact that I never saw the Wizard of Oz until I was an adult, because
That
back
would
in
be,
the day,
yeah,
yeah,
that would have been a fun fact right there, right?
because back in the day, before streaming and recordings, Wizard of Oz only broadcast once a year, and it always broadcast on Sunday night.
That's
And
right. It
so
was always Sunday night.
yep, I never saw it. And so, I honestly don't remember ever hearing evolution being denigrated from our pulpit, because creationism, specifically a 6 day
Mhm.
young earth version of creationism, was just the default. And we would have no more have questioned that than we would have questioned the existence of Jesus.
Right,
But
right.
I definitely remember my first questions. I had absolutely zero vocabulary to express those questions, but I remember the first time I felt uncomfortable with that understanding. And I was in middle school or junior high, as we called it. And believe it or not, in the 70s, science was not required for seventh graders, it was an elective. Uh, and I had decided that I wanted to take choir because it sounded fun. But unfortunately, or fortunately for me, my dad was a teacher in my school, and he is very, and still is very organized, very triple type A. And he didn't like the lack of discipline that he saw in the
Right.
choir room. So he signed me up for the science class, the
I
science
see.
elective.
Okay.
And I, to this day, credit him for changing the trajectory of my life.
Right.
Because despite the fact that we didn't require science, my school was a new school. It was kind of an experimental school, and I loved it. It fit a nerdy schoolgirl like me. And this seventh grade science class was amazing. We worked our way through all the different animal kingdoms, as we called them at the time. And I discovered that there were things that were animals that were not puppies and kittens and cows and horses, that these earthworms and these sea stars and these grasshoppers are also part of the animal kingdom. And then as we did these dissections, real life ones, not the
Right.
virtual ones that kids can opt out for these days, but I was discovering that there appeared to be connections between these very disparate groups of animals. That it looked for all the world like these systems had just been modified from a more a simpler form to a
Right.
more complex form.
Right.
And that all of these things seemed to be connected. But I had
You
no
didn't know how to
vocabulary to
say that.
express
Yeah.
that. No, I had not say.
Right.
I took those same questions into high school, and then I went off to university, a Christian university, by the way, which I loved and still love to this day. I was a biology major. And I distinctly remember in one of my first courses, a professor who ended up being my favorite professor. I took
Mhm.
several classes from him. I taught labs for him before I graduated. He just pointed out the section in the textbook and said, "This is about evolution. You need to know it."
Right.
End of story. And I got a biology degree, as did my husband. We were in the same university. And that is the extent of our evolution education. So fast forward, we become, young adults. Life happens, and I had just siloed things off in the back of my mind. I never was truly on board with the young Earth business. I didn't have
Right.
much of a problem with that. Um, but I just kind of did things like, if I can close one eye and squint the other one, can I make the days of creation match Genesis? And I just went with it. Well, after my dad volunteering me for the science class, the second big milestone that changed my trajectory happened a few years after my husband and I both graduated from Abilene Christian University. There was a young Earth apologist with no connection whatsoever to the university decided to go after the careers of two of the professors, longtime
Oh, really?
professors,
Yeah.
including the guy that was my favorite professor.
Right.
And he went in with guns blazing, accusing them of all sorts of things. Well, you can imagine donors, alumni, everything was stirred up. This would have been in the probably late 1980s. Um,
Right. Okay.
and so one of the professors was a tough old guy, and he survived the storm. But the professor that I had taught labs for was a very gentle man,
Mhm.
very humble. And it just destroyed him.
Wow.
He
That's
was
amazing.
he was humiliated,
Right.
humiliated. A couple of years ago, I was actually asked back to come to my alma mater and speak about my first book about evolution in
Yeah.
chapel of all places. So I'm happy to say the story has a wonderful
But
ending
better
for
ending. Yeah.
Abilene
Right.
Christian,
Right.
but unfortunately, um, Oh, what I was going to say is I was able to speak to a professor who was there at the time when all of this happened. And what he said was the ironic thing is that Dr. Manis was so conservative religiously, he
Really?
squeaked, but he was a
Wow.
man of science.
Well,
And
that's
he
yeah, yeah.
had begun teaching evolution in the classroom. So unfortunately, this professor passed away, a broken man, not
Oh,
too many
that's
years
sad.
after that
That
happened.
is a sad story.
It is a tragic story.
Well,
It
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 really
it changed my trajectory. You know, from
I can
that
see
point
that.
on, I read, I studied, I investigated on my own. I started writing. It didn't take much because I had, as I said, I'd had these questions since I was 13, 14 years old.
Right,
Um, and so I, for the first time, really read the evidence. I listened to speakers. I sought out people of faith who accepted evolution. I started writing, started with a blog. I taught a bit as I was asked to at the church I attended at the time. Admittedly, it was a soft sell. It was more of an introduction to this is what
right,
this says. And then I wrote the first book a couple of years ago about Christian denial of evolution. And then, as you said, coming out this fall is The God of Monkey Science. And
right,
along
right.
the way, I went to grad school, got a PhD. I started teaching 18 years ago at the University of North Texas, and the rest is history.
Right. Well, that story really brings out a point of that I have observed, as a former evangelicals, that evangelicals picked a war on evolution, and whether they were a young Earth creationist or an old Earth creationist, they were still warring evolution. But it's so sad to attack someone like that. And it turns out the guy is a religious conservative
Absolutely.
himself.
Yep.
And so it just proves the point that these evolutionists aren't sitting back in some, you know, smoke-filled room in the back going, okay, how can we misrepresent the data here so that we can attack the Christians. It's like,
Right.
now there
What's
are
their nefarious plan?
right, right. Now there might be a handful of like devout fundamentalist atheists, I call them, but most of them are not like that. Um, uh, Anyways, the next question I want to ask you is, how would you describe, because some people just go, oh, you can't believe in evolution. They might say, you have to believe in a single or at least a relatively in close in time miraculous event as the only way that God could be responsible for creating the world. I mean, how would you push back on that? And how did you integrate your faith with the acceptance of the theory of evolution?
Well, first of all, I like the way you put that with my acceptance of the theory of evolution. I don't believe in evolution. I don't believe in science. And I always tell my students that on the first day of the semester, and everybody looks like they want out of that class really fast. Because how I explain to my students is that a fact is a fact, regardless of whether I believe it or not. So when it comes to evolution, I accept the evidence for
Hmm.
evolution. And so and also I make the point that there are a lot of things in my life that I believe. I believe in that my family loves me. I believe in my faith, but that does not mean that I don't accept science evidence. And so, to those who have pushed back and to say that that is a position that is not possible to be a person of faith who accepts the evidence for evolution, um, I just like to ask the question, you know, why do you feel that a natural explanation for life, including humans, is demeaning?
Yeah.
How is it demeaning to have a natural explanation for something? For example, here in Texas, we desperately need rain. And you see on the church signage, you see it on Facebook, pray
Pray
for
for
rain,
rain.
pray
Pray.
for rain. And
Yeah.
if we get a couple of drops that evaporate before they hit the ground, everybody is thanking God for the
Mhm.
rain, which
Yeah.
is a fine thing to do. It's an appropriate thing to do. However, we completely understand that that rain came to us through the water cycle. And there is an explanation for how the rain came to us. Another example is that people consider a child coming into their family to be a blessing, a miracle. You know, it's something for which they are thankful to
Mhm.
God. But we completely understand whether a child comes into a family by birth or by adoption, that that child came into the family through a 9-month embryological process that brought that child to that family. No one would ever say that child is less than because that child was born of a 9-month biological process. And even further and back, if you want to talk about the ovum that existed in the child's mother
Right.
before.
Right.
And so I don't understand, this idea that somehow evolution demeans God, that evolution
Right.
demeans creation, that
Right.
evolution demeans human beings. What are we? You're saying we come from monkeys, which is not true. But as if that were something demeaning. And so I have come to a place where I'm quite comfortable in saying that nothing that's discovered in science will cause me not to believe in God. It's not going to be science that is going to wreck my faith. Even if we find evidence for abiogenesis and we find a definitive process by which abiogenesis occurred, if we discover multiverses, nothing that is found by science, no scientific evidence is going to challenge my faith.
Right.
Conventional, and I don't feel like I have to prove God using science.
Yeah. I think.
There's all, just a couple of weeks ago, someone sent me a social media meme with two columns. And on one side of the column was things that supposedly ancient people believed about science. And on the other side of the column was things that supposedly the Bible says about science that were true, but nobody knew in those days. So therefore, we have proved God.
Yeah.
But the problem with rationale like that is, number one, um, ancient people did know the earth was round. There was a librarian at the famous Library of Alexandria that
Mhm.
measured the circumference of the earth. And so, first of all, that's not true.
Right.
And second, what about all the things in the Bible that are scientifically incorrect?
Yeah.
And so we get into a lot of trouble really fast if we try to prove God, looking for God in science somehow.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I think one of the distinctions I've made is that sometimes people who are really upset with evolution, I think one of the main attacks is that it it the science is saying it's the Bible isn't correct about, the literal 7 days. The Bible isn't correct about, something else, like, oh, there couldn't have been a worldwide flood or whatever. And so they're really nervous about discrediting the Bible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which in my view is really misguided because of the nature of the Bible. It's not a
Right.
scientific book. It does have some problems in it, just because it has all kinds of ancient literature
Right.
before the modern science era had, or
Right.
philosophically, you could argue that it's got a problem. I critique it all the time, but
Right.
there's many inspirational things in the Bible too. But there's this kind of like all or nothing. If you find anything that's wrong,
Yes. Yes.
right, with the Bible because of science or whatever, then they're up in arms and just, you guys are just terrible people
Right.
for doing this, right? So I
Right.
think that's one of the distinctions, don't you think? And I think we would probably find out that maybe we're trying to figure out why, uh, if people are anti-vaxxers or something, that doesn't really seem to attack the Bible, or climate science doesn't really seem to attack the Bible. So, what is the difference between, back in the day, evangelicals did not have any problem with vaccines.
Right.
What has changed? I mean, my dad was always pro science,
Hmm.
etc.
Well,
Uh, but all of a sudden today, in the last, in the age of COVID, I've seen so many people that I would never have dreamed would be anti-vax, and they're anti-vax, and they believe a lot of conspiracy theories. What's the
yep.
difference?
Well, you're exactly right. It used to be that evolution was the only bad guy.
Yeah,
And
right.
yes, and so people of faith could fight evolution and still get their childhood vaccines and
Hmm.
be on board with anything else. Scientists used to be our heroes. They used
Yeah,
to be our heroes if you think about the race to space and things like that, but no longer. And so we have to, though, in order to trace back, how did we get to where we are today? We have to look back at what started it all. And that was in the 1920s, what's called the Scopes monkey trial.
right,
And
right.
so at the time of Scopes monkey trial, in which it was a whole setup, that's a whole other story. But the idea was um, a man was being accused of teaching human evolution in public schools, and which was against the law. And so you've got to understand that Darwin's theory of evolution had been around for decades prior to this, but it
Hmm.
had not made its way into the consciousness of the common people. It
Right.
was it was in the precinct of scientists. And then you also brought up about understanding and critiquing and looking at the Bible. At the same time Darwin was writing, there were primarily German theologians who were also looking at the Bible as through the lens of historical and literary
Right.
criticism.
Yeah, yeah.
And so what we have at the end of the 19th century was this perfect storm of scientists who are telling us that we came from monkeys, and we've got these elite intellectuals in their ivory towers telling us that the Bible is not the very literal words out of the mouth of God.
Right.
But again, it really wasn't part of the consciousness of the common man until we get into the 20th century, and it began to be talked about from the pulpits, and then we see the Scopes trial. So it's important to understand that although this trial was about teaching evolution, not a single scientist testified
Yeah, that's
during the
amazing.
Scopes
Yeah,
trial.
that's amazing.
No science evidence was
Right.
entered into testimony, but instead, William Jennings Bryan, the prevailing attorney, who was known as the Great Commoner, he was a popular orator of the day. If he were alive, he would have his own talk radio show, probably. He spoke the language of the common people and not the language of science. So when he made his argument against evolution, he said, there's no evidence for evolution, and even scientists don't accept it. He characterized people who accept evolution as enemies of the Bible.
Right,
And
right.
then here is a big one that leads us to where we are today. Bryant argued that since those who are against evolution are in the majority, if evolution is taught in schools, their rights are being violated. And so, fast forward to through the rest of the 20th century into the 21st century, and we've taken those same arguments And we've thrown them against the pandemic, against climate science. When I was researching this book, it was almost like uncovering argument fossils. We're still saying the science evidence is sketchy or wrong. We're still saying science threatens God. And we're still saying that acceptance of some of this science evidence comes at a cost of our personal rights and freedoms. And so what was interesting, to me is that as we find ourselves here in the third decade of the 21st century, we're not debating photosynthesis. We're not arguing about gravity. Evolution might have been the first science that offended Christians, but in the 21st century, it seems to be this package deal, as you said, along with vaccine denial,
Right.
all things COVID, and climate science. So why are these big three right now, part of a package deal? Well, again, we have to go back a few decades, this time to the late 70s, early 80s.
Right.
People up to this time who were religious would have considered themselves creationist. But in the late 70s, 1980s, early 80s, creationism was rebranded. And it is here at this point in history that the modern version of creationism was born. And so what we see coming out of this modern version of young earth creationism is the beginning of all these organizations and institutes dedicated to researching, publishing, and teaching creationism. The initial goal was to frame creationism not as something religious, but as science. And this is where we get the term creation science. That came out of the early 1980s.
Right.
But it wasn't long before these institutions, born out of this new creationist movement and dedicated to having creationism be seen as a science, found that they could not do that. They could not find evidence, science evidence for young earth creationism, that could stand toe to toe, with evolution science and geology that said the earth was ancient. So because these organizations could not disprove evolution, they switched gears. And instead of trying to promote creationism as science, evolution was then framed as the root of all cultural evils. It was the root cause of abortion, homosexuality, school shootings, disobedient children. It was easier to blame evolution for the culture than it was to prove it false. And so it's not a surprise that when science became a front in the culture war, the science community has always been suspect because they wanted to make our children atheists. But now, in the 21st century, they not only want to make our children atheists, but now they want to shut down our churches. They want to stop our public assembly. They want us to take a vaccine instead of trusting God as our protection. So what's next? What else will the government and its scientific minions try to make us do? And then when it comes to the evidence for climate science and trying to ameliorate some of those bad outcomes that we see on the horizon, we see science threatening our very American way of life. Science is threatening our gas cars and our gas stoves, even our ceiling fans. And so we took our initial arguments against evolution and retooled them against climate and vaccines and COVID. But where we really found the push to among people, communities of faith, particularly in evangelical precincts, was this idea that science is a front in a culture war. It's
Right.
always been in evangelical precincts about standing up to the world,
No,
standing up to
absolutely true.
culture,
Right.
David versus
Yeah.
Goliath, and we always see ourselves as the righteous underdog.
Right.
And so when COVID vaccines and COVID came into our public understanding and climate science came into our public understanding, we were geared up and ready to go. We had the arguments from fighting evolution for so long. And then the 1980s, the fight for creationism was reframed as a culture fight, and off we went. We
No,
were
that's
off to the
definitely true.
races.
Um, yeah, you can see that progression, and it's very clear. But the other part of it is that also evangelicals have always been programmed to not trust outsiders.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
so you
Yeah.
cannot trust anyone who's not a born again Christian or an evangelical,
Right.
or if they're too
Right.
liberal, if they're a Democrat,
Right.
if they're a scientist who believes in evolution, we certainly can't trust them. So so there's all this mistrust, and it started, with just distrusting evolution, but then it slowly evolved in a very at the end. It kind of very quickly evolved into this what you're calling a all-out culture war, even
Absolutely.
attacking things like climate science and
Hmm.
vaccines, et cetera. It's
Hmm.
just a phenomenon that just blows my mind. Before
Right.
we get into more into about the COVID and climate science, so I have one more question about, uh, you know, I'll just frame it this way. There's young Earth creationists who believe the Earth is very young, 6,000 or 10,000 years old, because of what the Bible says. And then
Hmm.
there's old Earth creationists who recognize that the Earth is very old, even 4 billion or whatever it is, but they still don't believe in evolution. And then those folks usually start talking about intelligent design theory. So um, I have, I don't, I would just say that I have pro and con things to say about intelligent design. And I might call myself an intelligent, I believing in intelligent evolution. In other words, if you believe in God and you still see the science of evolution, how did God, uh, you know, in during the process of evolution, how are there interactions that move that along? How did, like you said, the wisdom and the intelligence behind the creation, how did that work? Now, some people might say it worked through intelligent design, of interventions, let's say, of God. But other people, or like Francis Collins, I assume that you're an evolutionist in the realm of in the sphere of Francis Collins. How would he, he might have another way of describing it. So where do you come down on that?
On intelligent design
Yeah, like
specifically,
how would
uh,
you, is there a place for, let's say, talking about evolution as like intelligent evolution, somehow seeing some things from ID theory that makes sense and could be attributed to God, or what's another way of looking at it as a Christian who believes or accepts evolution?
well, first thing I would like to say is that I make a distinction between capital letters, intelligent design, and a lowercase um, idea of there being an intelligence or a wisdom or a logos underlying and sustaining creation.
Right,
When we talk about intelligent design or intelligent design theory, that is almost always referencing group, a specific group of institutions, writers, promoters, apologists. It's a specific way of looking at um, the development of life on our planet, that goes beyond just accepting a wisdom that underlies and sustains creation. So, I do have quite a few problems with the capital letter intelligent design
Okay.
movement. You know, first of all, I usually refer to it in my writing and speaking as intelligent design creationism, or the intelligent design version of creationism, because in reality, if you did a Venn diagram, there would not be a lot of area that did not overlap. Intelligent design is often just a way of defending creationist views. Now, I will say, I've never run across an intelligent design advocate that believed in a young Earth. So I will say
Oh
they
no, there
are.
are. There
Oh,
very
there.
many. Most of them
Oh,
are. Yeah, I
well,
would say.
I would say,
But no, there
yeah.
are some that do still believe in young Earth, but a lot of them don't believe in.
Well, I guess
You
what I'm thinking of are the big ID institutions. You know, they
right.
are not. That's not going to be part of the big publishing houses for intelligent design. But I would, you know, first of all, I'd just like to point out that um, advocates for design like to use the verbiage intelligent design theory, or the theory of design. Well, as a science educator, I have to just stop right there and say one of the definitions of a science theory is that a theory predicts new knowledge. A scientific theory predicts new evidence. Well, if life as we see it on our planet, from down to the cellular level, is the result of a design known only to the designer. Oh, which, by the way, the design, intelligent designs organizations and publishing houses, they quite often do not refer to the designer as God,
Right.
because they want to be seen as this alternative theory to
Yeah.
evolution.
Hmm.
So I'm using the verbiage of these
Right.
writers and advocates. So if design, if what we see, if the complexity that we see in living things and down to the cellular level is due to a design, a special design, tinkering by a designer, and this design and this tinkering is known only to the designer,
Hmm.
why research?
Hmm.
How do you predict? You can't predict. There's no prediction possible. If
Hmm.
you are chalking the complexity up to a tinkering of a designer, or a specific design that's known only to the designer, intelligent design does not meet the criteria for being a science theory. Um, And then there's just problems with the idea of a designer being responsible for life on Earth. You know, we all want to talk about, for example, the miracle of the human body. You know, we have this
Hmm.
chemical and this chemical. If they didn't
Right.
work just together in this specific way, then
Right.
the whole thing would fall apart. So we
Right.
love to credit um, a designer, which is God, with a designer. We love to credit this designer with what we see as these miraculous, wonderful aspects of
Hmm.
life. But if we credit the designer with things like this, what are we going to do with all of the broken genes that are littering our
Yeah.
genomes?
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Genes that are broken, that in the same way as broken genes found in our close evolutionary kin. Why would a designer insert broken genes? And why would a designer insert these broken genes in a way that looks for all the world like common ancestry, that life evolved
Right.
via
Right.
common ancestry? And then we have to just quite honestly look at bad design. If the human body was designed, there are some very bad designs, and there are also some deadly designs. An engineer looking at the human back will say it's an engineering nightmare. All the different curves in our
Right.
spine
Right.
that
Yeah.
result in back pain for so many people,
Right.
debilitating in some instances. We have the same pipe that handles our food and our air, which is why people die from choking on our food just from doing something every day, like eating a sandwich. Childbirth through a human pelvis is not a good design. And
Mhm.
for centuries, for actually most of human history, it's been the leading cause of death for women,
Mhm.
because of this design of childbirth going through the pelvis. We have other deadly, if you want to call it a design, things like the genetic uh, the gene that makes humans resistant to malaria is also the gene that causes the deadly disease, sickle cell
Sickle
disease.
cell. Right. Right.
Right. So we always want to credit the designer with things that we see as good, but no one wants to credit the designer with bad design,
Right. Yeah.
especially deadly design. And
Right.
then, intelligent design advocates will say, well, yes, we can do research. Because there are all of these things in the cell, for instance, is
Hmm.
unexplained, and
Hmm.
so it's so complex. It's never going to be explained. We have to chalk it up to a designer, and the phrase you will hear is irreducible complexity.
Right. Yeah.
That
I'm
things are
familiar with it.
so right. That things are so complex that there's no way they could have come together. Through a random process like evolution. Well, first of all, evolution isn't always random, but we'll set that aside for now. But what do we do as people of faith if we hold on to this idea that God tinkered at all of these steps along the way? And so that's why we see complex things that we can't explain. So, what do we do when those questions are answered?
Right.
What do we do when it is explained? We have just put God back to the back of the line. And so, and probably the last thing that I would say, especially to those who are still advocating for, creation science, intelligent design as an alternative for evolution, just a simple question: if there is so much evidence for a young earth or special creation or design or even a literal global worldwide flood, then why do we never see non religious scientists touting it? Why are there no peer reviewed articles by non religious scientists advocating for design or instantaneous special creation? If it truly was there, the evidence is there. Scientists love to prove each other wrong.
Right. Right.
If you could debunk evolution, you would, get on the plane now for your Nobel Prize, because you're gonna win it.
Yeah.
But there's just not any, not religious. It's a lot of negatives there. I'm sorry.
Right.
You just don't find non-religious scientists writing peer-reviewed articles, doing research to support instantaneous special creation or
Yeah.
design.
I think that certainly the instantaneous instant creation type of what I find in the ID camp, and I'll just say this one question, then we're going to move on. Okay. And this one
Okay.
thing is that there are some non religious people in ID, but they still are basically believing in evolution. They're kind of like maybe an intelligent evolution, they might say, but they say that the evolution is still there, but it's different than, certainly in Darwin's day. It's changed in, and there are you could still argue that, and that's kind of like the problem I have with the ID camp is that they really have a lot more in common with someone like Francis Collins and yourself, but they can't bring themselves to go there because so most of them have a religious agenda, although some of them don't. So it's an interesting phenomenon in my view. But let's pivot because we've kind of gone down this rabbit trail of evolution, and I want to focus the rest of our time on what's happened in the COVID era. So tell us, in your book, you go through how the COVID-19 vaccine was developed. You talk about Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett,
Uh-huh.
who developed the Moderna vaccine. So tell us about that, just how that happened briefly, and then what's your case for why we can trust the COVID vaccines?
Well, the one of the biggest um, arguments and hesitations during the whole COVID pandemic about a vaccine, even before the vaccine was released, was the speed at which the vaccine was being developed.
Right.
But what we have to understand is that RNA vaccine research was not new. Coronavirus research was not new. The SARS and the MERS, if you recall
Mm-hmm.
those,
Yes.
were both caused by coronaviruses. Neither of those reached uh, a global pandemic like COVID did, but they were in the same category, a related category of viruses. Well, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett was a young woman, a brilliant woman at the time of the COVID coming into our consciousness in the late 2019, early 2020. Dr. Corbett had been at the National Institutes of Health for 5 years, a young researcher just making all sorts of headway, getting lots of attention. She was definitely a person to look out for in the area of vaccine development. Well, Dr. Corbett, for 5 years, had been studying the MERS and the SARS viruses. Specifically, she was studying those spike proteins that we heard so much about that are found on the surface of coronaviruses
Right.
that allow coronaviruses to attack and to infect a cell. So for 5 years, Dr. Corbett had been studying these spike viruses found on the surface of coronaviruses. So when 2020 hit and we saw that this thing was going to be really big before the rest of us even knew it was going to be really big, Dr. Corbett was asked to switch gears and start looking at the COVID virus. And so, because of her work for the past 5 years, she already had the genetic code for the spike proteins for these other coronaviruses.
Right. You had a head start on all this.
Right. And what Dr. Corbett said was it was basically plug and play, which may be a gamer term. I'm not sure. I'm not a gamer. But she said it was basically plug and play. And she said it only took her a few hours to plug in the coronavirus spikes for COVID, the genetic information there. And so once she did that, she shared that information with Moderna, who had been working on these mRNA viruses. And unbelievably, in less than 2 months, just about 6 weeks, we're talking about here what I described to you, about 6 weeks, the first human trials for the Moderna COVID vaccine, these mRNA vaccines, went into study, the first human trials. And so that just scared a lot of people to death because it seemed like this was just too fast. This mRNA technology, you're talking about something that's going into my cells, and it just sounds scary because we've seen Gattaca and all the movies that scare us about RNA and DNA and all the other nucleic acids. Um, and so, from our perspective, outside epidemiology and immunology and infectious disease, it seemed like it happened at lightning speed. When in reality, it was built, the mRNA vaccines were built on years of
Right.
research. But
So,
because of this plug and play ability we have with this genetic code, and because we had spent 5 years trying to develop vaccines for SARS and MERS, it seemed like it was overnight. And,
right.
traditional vaccines have been usually relied on weakened or killed viruses to promote an immune response in the body. Well, it takes time to grow vats and vats and vats and vats and vats of viruses that can then be weakened or killed. And so we didn't have to do that with these mRNA viruses. It was a whole different approach to delivering what was going to promote or to provoke an immune response in the humans.
That's interesting. Another thing that you brought out in the book, and I really like this about the book, folks. This is, what she's doing is she's saying, okay, what's the backstory here? Here's what you hear. Here's the here's the conspiracy theory. Here are the concerns and the fears, but what's going on? And most people didn't know about this woman who had a head start on this vaccine, and there was a good reason why it happened quickly. And then they went into the first human trials and went from there to develop the vaccine. But there's also this story about, we saw in the news during that time, this group called the American Frontline Doctors
Oh, yeah.
and Dr. Simone Gold.
Yep.
And so, I have some friends who are anti-vaxxers, and that was one of the things that they brought up. Oh, check out these people. They're real scientists. And they're, the thing that really bugs me about this whole conspiracy theory is that in order for it to be true, all these public health scientists have to be conspiring. It's just like the evolution thing, right? They're back in the smoke-filled room going,
Yeah.
how can we plan a pandemic?
Right.
How can
Right.
we make vaccines dangerous and actually kill people?
Kill
That's what we
people.
want to
Right.
do. I mean,
Right.
it's like crazy.
That's in the Hippocratic Oath. There we go.
Yeah, right. So that's what has to be true for these conspiracy theories to be true. But tell us about American Frontline Doctors. What's the backstory with them, and why are there claims of dangerous vaccines and ivermectin being the better way to go and all this stuff? Why isn't that not based on good science?
Well, you're right. It happened early in the pandemic. It was at the beginning of what we didn't know at the time was going to be about a 3-year experience. So early in 2020, this group of doctors calling themselves America's Frontline Doctors
Right.
assembled on the steps of the Supreme Court of the United States. So
Yes, I remember
imagine,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
imagine the optics of this. You have
Hmm.
this group of 20-ish doctors all wearing their white coats, starched white coats, the universal symbol of a medical professional. And they're on the steps of the Supreme Court, which is at least a national symbol of respect. And here's the key word: authority.
Right.
Respect and authority. So the optics were all in place, and that this was touted as a press conference. And so there were a couple of doctors. Simone Gold was one, and there was one or two others that spoke for the group. And the alternative, or the drug of choice at this point, was hydroxychloroquine. And these doctors who spoke claimed to have cured hundreds of patients with hydroxychloroquine. So, despite what you hear those scientists over at NIH telling you, don't believe them, believe us. We have cured our patients with hydroxychloroquine. And so, one intrepid, I guess, a member of the press at this particular press conference spoke up and ask, have you published your data?
Yes, right.
Have you published your data? And one of the doctors replied, basically, my data are not important for you to see. And another one of the doctors, I believe this was Gold, replied, not everyone needs to publish in order to be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And so I also have to tell you that on the first day of every semester, I put a photograph of America's frontline
Oh,
doctors
yeah.
on the steps of the Supreme Court
Right.
up on the screen, and we talk about what makes something good research. How do scientists work? What makes something science? What is suspect? And I will tell you, even freshman students in their first college biology class, you should see the looks on their face. Because we've already been talking about prior in this class time about what makes a good science research study. And then I tell the story of America's frontline doctors. And even these freshman students, first semester of their college experience, can spot the red flags of
Right,
bad
right,
science
right.
research.
What are some of those red flags?
Of what the
Bad research,
America's, yeah.
bad scientific research.
Well, specifically in this case, was the fact that it was all these doctors were saying what their claims were all anecdotal claims
Yes.
based on their own observations. And so, anecdotal claims. There was no peer review.
Hmm.
Nothing had been published, even put out as a paper before it
Hmm.
was published in a peer review journal
Yeah.
for other doctors and researchers to see what their claims were. We have no idea the size of their experimental group. We have no idea if they controlled that group. Did they control for other possibilities? There's just all sorts
Right.
of red flags. Now, I will say that at the beginning of the pandemic, we were all desperate. It became very clear quickly that we were dealing with something that most of us had not dealt with in
Right.
our lifetimes. And so there were actual science studies, some by the NIH, some by private universities using private research money, but across the board, including in the United Kingdom, using their national health plan data that they have, looking at the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, which
Right.
came on the
Right.
scene a few months after
Right.
hydroxychloroquine was the drug they don't want you to know about of the hour. It then also became ivermectin.
So what you're saying is while they were saying, "Oh, we've got the cure," right? You
Right.
other scientists were studying this to
Yes.
confirm, hey, this could be it could be a cure.
Exactly.
Let's
Exactly.
make sure
Exactly.
it is.
It
And they
wasn't, yeah, it
didn't
wasn't
determine that it was.
right. It wasn't like scientists were ignoring
Right.
anecdotal evidence,
Yeah.
but interestingly, the hydroxychloroquine studies were shut down very quickly. And not because it was dangerous, but because it became clear almost immediately that there was no difference between taking hydroxychloroquine
Right.
and a placebo. And
Yeah.
there was no reason to continue all
Right.
of these large, double blind, controlled studies. It's the same with ivermectin. When there was anecdotal information that ivermectin was killing the COVID virus, we found out it was killing it in a petri dish in levels that would be toxic
Right.
to
Too high
to
levels.
any
Right.
human,
Yeah.
right? And so it wasn't that these were looked at; they were
They
researched,
weren't. Yeah. They
but
were looked at. They
right,
weren't. ignoring them. Right.
Right. But what these America's frontline doctors were doing were getting up in using and showing all of these aspects of authority. And I talk more about that in the book, contrasting authority versus expertise. And
Right.
this is a prime example of that. They had all of the trappings of authority: white
Hmm.
coat, doctors
Right.
on the steps of the Supreme Court. But what they did not have was expertise in the field. They were not infectious disease docs,
Right.
they were not researchers. Um, and so they were outside the medical community's consensus
Yeah.
of opinions on
And
these two
and
particular
I
drugs.
and I would add they weren't doing proper research. They were cutting corners.
Exactly. Exactly. And what I found interesting doing research for this book, because I did not know it initially. Initially, I'm just like, wow, they are just really presenting a lot of bad science. That was my first impression of this group when they came out. But a deeper dive, uh, and I discovered that this was not a group of doctors, disparate doctors, that, hey, I'm doing this, you're doing this, we're all doing this. Let's kind of get together. And
Right.
we could call ourselves America's frontline doctors, and we could be a help. And no, 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 no. That's not how the group started. This group was actually, of America's frontline doctors, was actually created by an organization, a politically right-leaning organization that had its roots in that hyper-conservative takeover of the
Yeah.
Southern Baptist Convention of a few
Right.
years ago. So
Wow.
this was a group that was not put together by chance or by accident. This group was put together with a purpose.
Yeah. With
And
a
as
with a
and yeah,
an
and as
agenda.
the
Right.
yeah, an agenda, absolutely. And as the pandemic wore on, when all of these large studies came out showing that hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin were not effective,
Hmm.
the leader of the group, Simone Gold, continued to speak in churches.
Yes, I
Churches
noticed that.
continued to
Right.
invite her, and she continued to promote these alternative treatments and to advise against taking a vaccine that was soon to be released.
No, that's incredible. And I think the conspiracy theories broadened from there to denigrating Dr. Anthony Fauci and
Right,
putting all
right,
kinds of
right,
nefarious motives behind
right.
supposedly behind him
Yep,
and
yep.
and I don't know. I remember people saying, "Well, you have you ever heard of VAERS, VAERS? That's got all kinds of things in there. That's evidence that the vaccine is harmful." And then when I researched it, I found out, well, yeah, but that's just reporting things that they can as a base, so they can research it to see if it actually is harmful. It's not just, it's not the end all of all conclusive. Is that right? As far as
Exactly. When you have something that's self-reported,
yes,
self-reported like VAERS, and I'm not saying it's not a valuable data point, but
right.
when you are making your entire case built on VAERS, you have self-reported
Hmm.
um, vaccine experiences, and so what we don't know is the person who self-reports is, I had my COVID vaccine and I felt sick. It was horrible. And then I passed out. And then I ended up in the emergency room. So therefore, COVID vaccine is bad. But what we don't have from this self-report is that this person was a type 1 diabetic and they didn't take their insulin for that day.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
It's
right.
not a controlled
Yes,
situation where
right.
you're controlling for um,
Exactly. Yeah.
other
No, and
outside
it's
factors
just
that
bad.
might.
It's a bad research. If you rely on that for your conclusions, that's bad research, basically.
Absolutely. And there
Right.
is a reason why the best science studies are double blind, which means neither the participant nor the researcher knows who is getting the treatment.
Yes.
Someone's got it written down somewhere,
Right.
but no one knows, because human nature will play a game on our mind, and that if we get the treatment or if we get a vaccine, if we're afraid of the vaccine, then we might feel bad after we get the vaccine. We may feel tired, we may feel shaky, our hearts may race. And if we've got a placebo and was told it was a vaccine, if we are going to respond that way because of our fear, we would respond that way to a placebo. So
Right.
that's
Yes.
why
Right.
scientists double blind their studies. But you're exactly right. There was nothing that I have ever seen about the denigration of scientists during the COVID pandemic. Like I said earlier, scientists used to be our heroes, and there was no one who was denigrated more than
Then
Anthony Fauci
Dr.
at,
Fauci.
at
Yeah.
the
No.
time.
Incredible.
He was called all sorts of things, but flip flopper was one of the big ones.
Yeah.
Flip
Right.
flopper, he speaks out of both sides of his mouth. But, again, just going back to what makes something good science. Early in the pandemic, we didn't know it was a novel coronavirus, and we called it
Mhm.
novel for a reason, because it was new. So early in 2020, we were not sure if asymptomatic people could spread the virus. We were pretty sure that they could, but we didn't have enough
Right.
studies in to know if asymptomatic people. Also, at the time, we were not ready with medical equipment for a global pandemic. So you could not go to the local CVS and get a box of masks for
Right.
yourselves. And so before we knew if asymptomatic people could spread the virus, and when everybody was hoarding toilet paper and paper
Right.
towels, we weren't sharing, we weren't being very good at sharing. Dr. Fauci said, there's no reason to mask right now. Let's save the few masks we have for our medical personnel, which made perfect sense. So when 2 or 3 months later, when the studies were coming in and we realized that asymptomatic people could indeed spread the virus, Fauci came back and said, everyone needs a mask. Do
Right.
not go out without a mask. And oh, the world just
Yeah.
ended. The world
No, no.
ended.
Yeah.
Fauci lied the
Oh,
first
yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Fauci is lying the second
He's a
time. He's flip
flip-flopper.
flopping, but that is what science does.
Yes. No, it
Science
makes perfect sense.
changes its mind with new evidence. And,
But this the new evidence. It's right. He's not based on the evidence I know. This is the best advice I can give you. Next
right,
week I got new evidence. Okay, I have to
right,
change my
right.
advice if I'm honest.
Right. And that is what you said right there. What you
Yeah.
just said is exactly why we love pseudoscience, because pseudoscience provides certainty. Drink this supplement and your migraines will go away. Do this detox program and you will feel better than you felt in your entire life. Pseudoscience gives us certainty. Think about the doctors on the Supreme Court steps. I've cured all these patients with hydroxychloroquine. Science, on the other hand, never speaks in terms of certainty. You won't see in scientific literature the word prove. Because to say proved means we've learned everything and there's nothing more we will ever find out.
Yeah.
Science just does not speak in terms of certainty. Science speaks in terms of, this is the best evidence we have right now. This
Yeah.
is the consensus of the field right now. And, as human beings, we crave certainty. So we drift toward pseudoscience, and
Yeah.
we accuse our scientists of being flip-floppers, liars, and worse.
No, it's true. And the other thing is that the science is not is not 100%.
Right. Oh, yeah.
So not that the vaccines are 90 or 94% effective. Uh, yes, there are some people that if you have these conditions, you shouldn't take the vaccine. Yes, there are side effects, but if you get the disease, it's going to be worse. And there are all these statistics and everything, and you're trying to explain it to people,
Right.
and some people, like you said, they just have to have everything fall in line. And it's I think it was just the cult of denialism and conspiracy theories that took over, and people stopped thinking reasonably about the whole thing. It was just crazy.
Right. Right.
So, well, we're running out of time, Janet, but we haven't had a chance to get into some of the other things that we were going to talk about. But I'll just let people know that in your book, you also talk about something called the Wakefield study of the MMR vaccine, and how
Mm-hmm.
that theory was debunked, that no, there is no tie with autism and that vaccine. There's also, you go into climate science and some of the denialism that's going on there, and why we can trust climate science. So you've got a lot of good stuff in there, and I want to encourage people to get the book and check out Janet Ray. She's got not only very interesting story of her life, but also some really good uh, wisdom about how to approach science. One last question, make it quick, but what do you think is the best way for someone to be true to both their faith and science?
Well, I would just start by saying that we've got to understand that if people of faith deny demonstrable empirical evidence, we have just completely taken ourselves out of the broader conversations. I mean, who's going to listen to us? When we speak to science, who's going to listen to us? Who cares about our take on things if we are denying empirical evidence? I am well, no, not probably. I am not going to listen to a flat earther
Right.
tell me about the best way to approach climate change. I'm
Yeah.
just not going to do it. And so when we deny science as people of faith, we've just taken ourselves out of the conversation, out of the conversation. And so, we just admit we have nothing to say about it. We can pretend it's all a conspiracy, we can say it's all politics, or we can speak as people of faith, as a voice into modern science. And
Right.
people have asked me, what does that look like? Well, it looks like, okay, evolution is a fact. Humans share ancestry with all life. So, given that fact, how do we rise above our natural evolutionary instincts to put ourselves first? We say, okay, germ theory is real. Germ theory is a fact. So, given that fact, how can churches best serve in the time of a deadly pandemic?
Right.
Do churches need to take their contribution money and hire attorneys so they can keep their buildings open for worship services? Or do we need to use our resources to help our communities and our neighbors who can't work from home or who live in
What's the
multi-generational
best way to love our
houses?
neighbor and
Yes,
get out of this mindset of, like, this is the only way to worship God and to love our neighbor is to be in these buildings every
absolutely.
month? I mean, that it's just incredible how
Right,
narrow-minded that is. That's just
right.
amazing.
And this is actually a sobering question to me. You know, we can lead, but if we're not going to lead, we can at least get out of the way. We know that evangelical Christians, specifically white evangelical Christians, were the leading demographic, about 40%, who were resisting precautions and not wanting to take a vaccine and being
Right.
against vaccination during COVID. So I can't help but ask myself the question, how long was this 3-year pandemic extended because this huge demographic
Mhm.
refused to mask,
Right.
refused to stop meeting in great groups, in large groups, or refused to be vaccinated. You know, we got in the way. We not only did we not lead, we got in the way. And
Yeah.
I think we need to do some serious thinking, some serious soul searching about the role of people of faith in a modern scientific world.
Yeah, and a good place to start is to read Janet's book.
Yes.
So I'll put that out there. Thank you so much for being with us, Janet. I really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a great questions. I loved it.
Right. Okay, folks, that's it for this episode. Until next time, enjoy responsibly.